It's drag racing this Friday night under the lights at fabulous Carlsbad Raceway.
The spectacular 200-mile-per-hour nitro-fuel dragster competition, highlighting another action-packed Friday night of drag racing at beautiful Carlsbad Raceway.
The big Friday night drag racing season swings into high gear when Ford, Chevrolet, Pontiac, Dodge, and Plymouth meet heads up in a devastating final for drag racing supremacy.
Plus lightning-fast Altereds and Roadsters, high-winding Gassers, and the 7-second tire-smoking supercharged dragsters racing side by side at supersonic speeds in the big go for top eliminator.
Beautiful Carlsbad Raceway is located 7 miles east of Highway 101 on Palomar Airport Road, north of San Diego.
Final eliminations, 8 p.m.
Friday night at fabulous Carlsbad Raceway.
Be there.
That's who that is. So, but back in those days, Art Christman had a garage on El Segundo Boulevard, just right there, just before Wilmington. There, just on, and Dale Smart's business was there on Weber Avenue, just before Alameda, and so we had to go by and see who's doing what, you know. And so we met Art many years ago. And they were building stuff, but I took, you know, then when I met Amos Satterley, basically he was doing the engine work at Earl Stone's garage for his own stuff. Earl Stone was a machine shop where Frank Cannon sent a lot of his work for the core drilling business. And that's where I met, from Earl Stone, that's where I met Amos Satterley. Amos worked for everybody. He did a lot of different work. Yeah. And so, but he would go out and they would run Lions, and then they first car that I remember running 200 miles an hour. And how were they able to do that at Lions? And so I'd go over there and we'd check the car out, and here he had a towel over in the floor of the car, and I says, "What are you hiding under there?" He says, "I can't tell you that," he says. I says, "Come on now." I says, we can't compete with you. You know better than that. We're just learning." I says, "You know that." So he pulled the towel off and he showed me a 3-way valve, hydraulic valve, that had a arm connected to the clutch arm, the throwout bearing arm, basically, the cross shaft, that it would allow it to slide the clutch. In other words, it would release slowly. You let it out, your foot off of it, but it would come back very slow and allow you to slip your clutch. Because in those days, we were buying Schaefer clutches, and they were 2 discs and 3 discs and stuff like that. And they also sold magnetos and things, and Schaefer was very gracious to Dale Smart and I gotta tell you, we did well with that stuff that we ran. And of course, we were buying Arias pistons, because at that time Nick Arias was in the business for the second car that we made. We were buying Arias pistons for the fuel motor. And plus I got a lot of free pistons from Frank Cannon, because he just spent money like crazy. He just spent a lot of stuff.
Good to have friends like that.
Yeah. But I mean, he even gave us barrels and barrels that looked like nail barrels, like some miniature barrels full of nails. You know, I don't know if you've ever seen. They look like wine barrels, but they're miniature, full of spark plugs. Then they were all different brands: Autolite and Loge and Champion and AC Delco and all of those. But the fuel spark plugs. He said, "Well, some of those you can rebuild, some you can't do anything with." Well, the Loge plugs, they were like the ones they used in aircraft. They were the ones you could rebuild those. You could take the porcelains out, repair them and what have you.
A rebuildable spark plug.
But Cannon was a pretty smart guy and very innovative. He gave me a bunch of pistons, boxes of pistons, that some weren't any good and some were good. And we basically, they were in an old cast iron 392 engine that we were running. But anything that we could fit the bore, we would use the piston, and even if I had to file the ring lands and all that, because sometimes they were cooked. But I would run it, I don't care what compression it was, it didn't make any difference, because we weren't running that fast anyway. But we would run the stuff. But in the assortment of pistons, he had a piston with a screw on top. I says, well, this is different metal. He says, yeah, it's stainless steel. And all the rings were connected to the stainless steel top, and it was just threaded onto the body of the aluminum piston where the connecting rod connected to. Wow. I says, really? He says, yeah, but what happened is he didn't provide the expansion rate different metals, and the tops kept popping off because he didn't have a hole drilled into the aluminum where the gases that would form between the two metals would change the temperature of the alloy, and anyway they would pop off. So some were still together and some weren't, but I never used them because I didn't want to have something come apart when I was driving. So anyway, that was well, we were learning on the second car. Anyway, we got fairly successful with it. We started making rounds, and Bob Hightower was the driver, and he was my neighbor in Maywood when I lived in Maywood. And so we did started doing okay. We would we'd run 2 or 3 rounds. Sometimes we'd get beat, and we'd learn why and make changes in the motor. And we got a little better and a little better. And we'd sometimes have runner-up. I love those guys in Bakersfield, the Ridge Route Tears. James Warren was a pretty gracious guy. We raced him for some money at Lyons one time. We were the final 2 cars. And he broke. He hurt the engine, and he spun a bearing and the whole thing. And I said, "We'll wait for you." "You'll wait?" I says, "Yeah, whatever it takes. We'll wait. We want to race you." He says, "Okay." So he fixed the motor. He got it back together. It was online. We were online. I mean, his thing was not doing well. It didn't have much oil pressure in what he had. Well, he blew our doors off. I mean, he just disappeared. He put it on kill, and he went, and we come back with our tail between our legs. I said, "We shouldn't have waited. We were damning ourselves right and left." And said, "No." So he came over and he says, "Here, I'm splitting the money with you guys. You guys waited? Here it is." Well, one of the early hot rod reunions, I met up with him there at the Doubletree Hotel. I says, "I will never forget how gracious you were back in that event." I says, and I told him about it. He says, "Well, that was the right thing to do." He says, "That was the right thing to do." I says, "You guys didn't have any money, and we didn't have any money, and whatever we had, we put back in the car." I says, "Well, that was with us, but we had less money than you." I says, later he got sponsored by Rain for Rent, but they did pretty well. I mean, they did well. They were very smart guys. But they're no longer with us, and they've passed now. But those were the experiences that we had in the time of drag racing. I backed away from the drag racing entirely, and got more interested in the mechanical side of things, and staying kind of hovering around the Arias camp, seeing what was going on there. And when Dale Smart got connected with Nick Arias again, with wanting to run the Arias product, that piqued my interest. And when he offered me the opportunity to come be part of the crew, even though I told him I wasn't going to be able to put any money in, even though I had the business still at the time, result was that I said I'd help build the motors and things like that, because it became a pretty large undertaking. And Dale had money, so he built more than one motor. So he had backup stuff. I says, "Well, that's pretty good." I says, so in the shop we would build it. And I don't know where I got pictures of that somewhere as they were working in the shop. But he actually added on to his property there in Compton a real nice shop. Had a mezzanine and living quarters up above with a complete kitchen. And during my time in business, I had made a lot of contacts and was asked to do a lot of things with different companies and things. And one of the companies I did stuff for was Volkswagen North America. because when I had my equipment business, I was acquainted with them through the former owner of my company that he did a lot of work with them. He built in-house wheel alignment racks for the German alignment equipment. Was called the Matra. The Matra system was a 4-wheel alignment system. And he built his own turn plates. He had the tooling to make cast iron turn plates. And he built turn plates for them and made holding fixtures on the alignment racks where he could line up the 4-wheel alignment holding fixtures. And it was basically, at that time, optical, where you could see, you just make it a square and know what camber for the rear and what camber and toe for the front and all of this stuff. But every dealership that had the Matra system in Morrisboro would build a rack for. So he built quite a few Volkswagen racks for the Mercedes, VW basically.
I was
Volkswagen.
gonna say that was an import thing more than domestic.
It was a big deal.
Yeah.
But I learned about the Matra system, so when they decided to rebuild a whole new facility there off of Sunset Boulevard and close down the existing building and sell the property off, I got the opportunity to go in there and bid on the equipment to buy it as surplus.
Oh, wow.
He says, we're going to trash it, so whatever you give me is fine. You just give me a fair price and do that. So I did. But they had in that building were bridge cranes, big, huge bridge cranes with twin rails all the way down. And so I bought the cranes. I bought those. I bought the vehicle lifts. I bought all the equipment for the tires and wheels and brakes. They wanted me to buy all the parts storage, which was not cost effective for me to buy because it would be more labor to take it down than it would be for me to buy it and resell it and stock it and haul it and everything else. It just wasn't practical. But I bought everything else. But in the process of that, knowing that they were going to tear the building down, upstairs in the facility mezzanine was a complete kitchen. And all compact, where you had oven, stove, sink, refrigerator, all out of steel, all metal.
Wow.
And it was huge. It was, from the window up to the wall there, all covering one whole wall. I says, can I have that? Sure. Make me an offer I can't refuse. He says, I give you, well, this is my labor is going to cost me X amount of dollars, so I'm going to give you this amount of dollars for the thing. Yeah. He says, it's yours. I says, okay. So we get to that point, I'll tell you when to come and get it. I says, okay, no problem. So I got all the plumbing and everything. It was all complete unit. So I got that, and so I went down to Dale's. I says, guess what we got? He says, what do you mean we? I says, well, you're going to get it because you're building your mezzanine and it's going to fit perfect in your mezzanine. So I says, well, bring your truck. So he says, I got bridge cranes too. He says, I want them, I'll buy them. I said, well, you got to bring your crane truck and all your stuff. I says, okay. So they came with me and we saw how we had to cut the beam to drop the cranes with the trolleys and all that stuff down. We loaded them on. It took us a week to get everything out of there. Went up in the mezzanine, went to the kitchen. He got the whole damn deal up there. It worked out great.
Good used parts.
Yeah, so anyway, but he took sick later, and the end result was that he didn't do well.
A lot of stuff I'd pick up left and right, but I don't know a lot about this valley and the shops and the people that were here in the early days on the hot rods.
Well,
and there's just not a lot of the young guys. We drive by that and we'll never know.
Yeah.
We'll never know what was there. Just like Carlsbad, you drive by it and you never know it was even there.
Yeah. Well, the Paisano family grew and did a lot of different things. I mean, Nick Arias' story is part of that deal, and
he was the first guy that actually built that type of engine, Arias?
Well, let me say this. In drag racing back in the early days, the cars that seemed to be doing the best were the ones that were Hemi powered, whether it be the Dodge or the DeSoto or the early Chrysler engines, but they were all Hemi headed deals.
Right.
But the small cubic inch motors like the little DeSotos and the little Dodges were performing quite well because of the design of the combustion chamber. And every time Nick would go to the races, all he would hear was, when he would go to sell pistons, he would hear, "Wow, man, if only we had a head on a Chevrolet, because he was a Chevy guy, 100%, If we had a head like a Chrysler on a Chevrolet, man, we'd be competitive. We would do this, we would do that." So he got to thinking about it, and he decided, well, okay, let's see what we can do. So he had, by that time, he was quite productive in pistons. I mean, his background was that, well, I can tell you the Nick Arias story from the beginning, but at this point in time, he was producing parts. He started his own piston company in '69 after leaving Venolia, not actually willing to leave Venolia, but being voted out of the corporation for political reasons. But the bottom line is that he did some work for Anson Automotive, which was, the owner was Lou Center of Anson.
I remember that.
And Louis was took a liking to Nick, and when Lou decided to sell out and retire, he was going to sell to Whitaker Corporation the biggest part of his business, which was the wheel manufacturing business. Louis made custom wheels, and the first to bring in custom wheels for all the different cars. And the best deal he could get was in the foreign country to make the wheels. I think he was making wheels in Japan at the time, but bringing them in by the shiploads because of the price. And Whitaker Corporation saw that and said, we want to be that. We want to have that. We want to get into the American automotive performance side of the business, but it's the show and shine stuff, not necessarily the performance end of it. At the same time, Louis was making connecting rods, and he was also making pistons. So he would ask Nick, well, come and work for me. He says, well, I'll work for you, but I'm not, I'd really like to buy your company. He says, well, I'm not ready to do anything right now. He says, but anyway. So when Whitaker stepped up to this deal and decided to buy Louis, he says, well, now I got to get rid of this other stuff because they don't want this deal. They don't want the rods. They don't want the pistons. They don't want anything internal of the motor. They just want the stuff that will sell to the consumer market, not necessarily the racing market. So that being said, if I'm not mistaken, I think the connecting rod side of the business, and I don't know if it went to Bill Miller or who was the other guy that was in Orange County that made connecting rods?
Probe?
No.
Brooks?
Brooks.
Yeah.
Bob Brooks. Bob Brooks bought the rod side. Either Bob or Bill Miller, one of the two, bought the rod side of the business. So when Louis made the deal with Nick, he was beside himself. He says, well, what if I fail in this deal and can't pay you? Louis told him, he says, if you fail in this business, I'll buy it back from you. And Louis had already a large clientele that was buying Anson pistons. And so Nick said, okay, you got a deal. So he started making product and selling to the Anson customers while he was building his own clientele and starting to put out his business card and what have you. And so Louis's wife, Betty, she hated to have Nick come into the office because what he was bringing were invoices for pistons that were their own customers that he was already producing parts for, see. So that's how Nick maintained his business, and it grew like crazy. But Betty was a sweetheart. I mean, she's the one actually that made that Louis ended up with money, because bottom line was he'd spend it if he had it. He would spend it. he got involved with IndyCar racing.
Oh, wow.
Parnelli Jones drove for the cars, Vels Ford and all that stuff, and Louis and used to go back to Indy every year. But he was a sponsor. He was between he and Vels Ford and Anson Automotive were sponsoring the cars that Parnelli Jones drove. So they did pretty well back in those days. But nonetheless, Nick ended up in the piston business and started to excel. And when he decided that he was going to now build a head for Chevrolet, he put together a team. Rudy Muller was engineer draftsman from I believe Lockheed Aircraft at the time, kind of semi-retired, kind of a recluse living over I think near Inglewood somewheres, and he had his drafting deal all set up over there. And Rudy was pretty well known by quite a few people as to his ability and knowledge, and Rudy had already designed a lot of different things, including his own engine. He had designed a complete engine for himself. The Moeller engine is basically what it was. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, because I'll say that in later years, I don't know if you know Don Ferguson or not down there. Don Ferguson, the Ferguson family own a forging house. They forge steel forgings. It's anyway, they're down in Wilmington today. They had a big operation in Texas and one here in Wilmington. Anyway, the Ferguson family are collectors of the early cars and engines and components of all the early stuff, and Model A times, 4-cylinder stuff, all that stuff, and anything that was made. But anyway, we'll get back to that. But anyway, so he got Rudy Muller. He had a young guy from the aircraft industry by the name of Tom Roberts, who was a pattern maker, and just right out of college, basically making patterns and stuff, and so they got interested in making a cylinder head, and they tried different versions of it. They tried one with a real long rocker arm, and then pedestal mount rocker arms, and then they tried different things on paper, and they did it. Rudy's drawings were exceptional in the fact that when he did a drawing, he would do the calculations in the midst of the drawing, and it would show you the various angles of how the rocker would move as to the movement of the push rod, how far it would move out, and the lift and all of that by doing the shadowing of the using of the pencils. And he would have dark and then lighter and lighter, and it would show, but you could see it like something Leonardo da Vinci would do.
Movies used to do in the books.
Yeah, yeah.
The book and
You could see that. It was all hand done. There was no computers that he did. So they finally decided on a 3-push rod setup, Hemi-cylinder head setup, meaning that on the intake rocker side, adjacent to that, there would be a bell crank with the other push rod connected to it to push a 3rd push rod to open and close the exhaust valve. So it would cross underneath the rocker arm of the intake and connect to the top portion of the rocker arm for the exhaust side. That's how it started out. And then they had to create how they were going to oil the system, because there was no oiling for overhead rockers for Chevrolet, you know, of that kind. So what they did was figure out how to oil it, and the decision was made to drill underneath the center rocker arm stand at the top rocker stud a hole from the main oil galley from the crank, a hole up to a distribution point to where it was a set screw machined and drilled from the bottom and then machined in the center where it would pass oil up to the center stand into the rocker shaft and out the rockers. That's how it was done. But the feed, that's how it was fed. That's how they did it. And then, but the original setup, that was the latest system. That was the latest oiling system for the 8.3 liter that occurred. But the original one, they tapped into the cam galley with an oil line in the front of the cam galley, an oil line at the back of the cam galley with a line drilled into the rocker stand, which was drilled into the hollow rocker shaft, which was plugged on either end. And under each rocker had a groove cut and an oil hole outlet to feed the oil out onto all the rockers. That was the original setup for the 3 pushrod Hemi-Chevy. That was, that version was 2 versions of the crossover 3 pushrod motor. There were 2 versions of that. The early stands were ductile iron, ductile rockers, but low profile stands. The next version was a taller stand to change the rocker ratio a little bit to improve upon it. But that too was a better way to do it, but still utilizing the same oiling system of that manner. Kind of like a Chrysler in a way. That's what the oiling system was.
I don't even know if I've even seen a set of those.
Yeah, oh, they're all over. They're still around. Some guys have got them in their garage, but I mean, the sad thing about it is, little did I know that I was going to be involved in doing any of this stuff. So, but I knew about all of it, and I knew how the tooling was made and for the casting purposes, all out of the good wood, mahoganies and everything, and so all the tooling was made in a double shrink tool for casting purposes. And so all that was done at the pattern shop across the street at Arias Industries. Once the patterns were done for the Hemi-Chevy, the patterns went to the Foundry, and then the parts were cast for the actual tool that was going to be used to take a casting from. Which means when I call it double shrink, the part that's made is bigger than the actual part out of wood.
So what year do you think this was? When you first came out?
Well, it was in the early 70s.
Yeah.
Very early 70s. I think the concept was in 73 or 4 for the rocker assemblies, I think. Later, it got to where when Rudy got done with that, nothing was changed from that concept until 2004. By that time, I was on board with the company. And Nick and I talked about this deal, and it was decided that we need to make it work like a Chevrolet, and I'm going to make a long rocker arm for the exhaust side. However it is, that's the way it's going to be. And we're going to convert it over to where it'll oil like a Chevrolet, meaning it would take oil that fed through the lifter galley, through the lifter itself, up through the center of the push rod, through the center of the adjustment screw. In the center of the adjustment screw, we would spray oil up in the valve cover, and it oiled down onto the shafts and everything like that. That was the final change when I was on board. We did that. And so when that happened, we got to making some parts and getting it out there to see how all this stuff was going to work. Well, in normal applications, it would work fine. Now, this is where Steve Montrelli got involved with this deal at the early stages of it and how to take it to market. All I know is the conversion. Steve has been sick off and on, in and out of Arias 2 or 3 times by that time. But he was very instrumental in getting the Hemi-Chevy into the marketplace. But the Hemi-Chevy lasted a short period of time and the parts went on the shelf. It didn't stay out too long because Nick had got a better idea in creating the Arias 8.3 liter engine, because the Chevy parts just did not hold up under the horsepower that the heads seemed to produce. And keep in mind that the head bolts at that time were all 7/16 in the Chevrolet, and he increased them up to 1/2 inch to make them stronger. And the heads would bolt onto the block, and then the rocker assemblies would bolt onto the heads. But he started thinking about all of this stuff, and he said, well, you know, the head we know works. So we're going to make another version of this. We're going to make it 8.3 liters. He says, but we need to know, you know, by that time, the interest peaked in making a complete motor, so he wanted to get a block, and so he got connected with John Rodak. And John had made lots of Chevrolet blocks to the point to where John was going to make another pattern for another Chevrolet block, but he wanted to upgrade the pattern. So Nick and he got together, and he decided he wanted to use that old pattern for a few castings to make the Chevrolet block, but they wanted to make some changes in it. One of the changes that occurred in making the 8.3 block was to lay the lifters over to all of them being 49 degrees instead of the Chevrolet, which I think was 43, and I forgot what the other 30 something, 36 or 38 degrees I think is what it was. But nonetheless, so, and then also make all the cam bearings one size, which was the number 2 and number 4 cam bearing was going to be the parent cam bearing for all the way through. So he had to buy the bearings directly from Durabond, and they were selling boxes of bearing after bearing after bearing. So that Chevrolet block became the block for the Arias 8.3 liter. And it started out as a Chevy block, but he decided, well, I need to use the truck deck height, which was the 10.2 deck. But as he looked at the design, he said, well, God, it would be better if we made it a taller deck. So he decided to go with an 11.2 deck. But behind the scenes of the building of this 8.3 liter, the key to all of this was to make it for the drag racer to go out and compete, but his child that he really wanted to make work was the 10 liter. The 10 liter had all the same features as far as bigger head studs, a 10 bolt layout that was equally spaced, and all of that as the 8.3 liter was. But he would want to get the 8.3 liter out there to make it a competitive motor, so he made it a solid block, 11.2 deck, and standard cam location. And then he decided, well, maybe the 10.2s would be good too, so we'll make both 10.2s and 11.2s, and that's what we'll do. Well, at that time, Joe Fontana was renting one of the portions of the complex there with Arias. And Joe decided to buy the product from Nick. Well, in the intent of it, Nick wanted to sell it anyway because he needed money to finish the 10 liter, because 10 liter was where the quote unquote money was, because it was for offshore boat racing. It was a water block, 10.2, 11.2, 12.2 deck, but the cam was completely out of the lifter galley. I think it was 10-inch, 200 tall, from the center line of the cam to the center line of the crank. And
well, does that block have bosses in it that all that stuff attached itself to inside?
it was actually a separate housing originally. It had its own cam housing that bolted into the block.
Okay.
It was machined where it fit down inside there.
Okay.
That
so
was
you
the
couldn't just-
that was the first 10 liter.
Okay, you couldn't just take a regular block and put the 10-liter
No,
cam in the top?
no,
Okay.
because it had a different location for rocker arms,
Mhm.
different location for,
Yeah, the push rods come out almost flat.
well, they were 10 degrees from being perfectly horizontal,
Okay.
okay?
And then they had to take a hole through the head, and the rocker looks like it was shaped different.
Well, it was because of the angle of the push rod.
Mhm.
But each deck height you went, you changed the angle of the hole in the head for the push rod.
Right.
So you didn't, people don't know that, but I mean,
Mhm.
that's really what it is.
And if you look at the trough that was in the head, I mean, it was like the whole material had to come out to get the push rod to align inside of there, just enough to go to where it could hit
Well,
a rocker.
The problem with that setup was that you had, that block was designed and made completely of cores. When I say cores, I'm talking about fitted pieces that put everything in position. It was like, I can't say Rubik's Cube, but it was like a puzzle, like a block puzzle, a box puzzle. And when you see the cope and the drag at the Foundry, the drag is in the floor. And how they make the drag and the cope both is that they have heavy-duty square boxes that the sand will be compacted in, which is a black sand. And then you put your cores in there for the making of the block, okay? And once the core is packed around that sand, that box is then placed on a cement floor and the wood parts come off of it. Now it's a mass of black sand held together by a bonding agent. And it's now ready to receive another type of sand, which are made of cores, that will come apart once the metal is poured around them. So it's like a negative, giant negative. And so the cores are made up with inverted, basically. You put in your cylinder cores, basically, and they have to be basically, once they're placed in line, they're all different spacing apart. They're basically all 4840 bore centers. They're placed in line, and then the last pieces that go in are the front of the block and the back of the block. Then come the water jackets. They're a solid piece also. So they're set in place and held in place until the bonding agent that holds them in place or solidifies and hardened, and then you take your support pieces out anyway. Included in those cores are, for the cylinders, are what's called chills. The chills allow the metal to solidify at the same rate that's necessary, not chill too fast, not chill too slow, but the same rate so the metal flows out of the gating and the risering that's created in the cope. The cope is the cap that goes on everything after all the cores are in place. I call them chimneys, but they're vents. That's the gating. Then those are the risering for all of that stuff to happen. But to set everything in place so you don't have core shift is a difficult thing. I mean, it's you have to hold things together. You have aluminum wire in there to hold the cores in certain areas. You got to have in there. It's got to be set up. It's probably the hardest pattern to work with that's ever been produced. The 10 liter. It's very difficult to build that. I have been there at the Foundry where something moved, and so when you go to pull it out and trim it all down, because it's a massive aluminum. In fact, on my webpage it shows a photo of it right out of the mold. And it has the chimneys on it and all the massive material all the way around, and all that has to be cut off in order to give it a shape of an engine block.
A lot of machine work.
Yeah, well, it's a lot of saw work first, and then grinding work, and then they send it out for shot blast, and then it comes back, and then they have to detail all that, And then when they send you, give you a part, you got something that resembles what you bought from the foundry, you know. Then that's only the first phase. Then it goes to the machine shop, and they do the preliminary setup in the machine shop, meaning that the block has to be qualified. When you qualify a block or a head, you start from the center line of a bare casting, because you don't know the latitude in a foundry is 100 to 250 thousandths.
Well, yeah.
So you got to know where you are with all of this stuff. So what do? You start from the center line of the deck of the block, and you measure both ways, 4/840 both ways. Then you qualify the front of the block and the rear of the block. That way you can now put it up on a pallet on the bell housing side to start putting in your holes for either threads or the cylinders, and to clean all of that up and then reverse it and figure all the holes that's going to be in there to hold the pans and all this stuff on, all the detail stuff. And on the face, all the holes to hold the gear drive on the back side to hold all the plugs and things for water and oil and all that stuff. And then that's how, but it goes through the qualifying process first, front and rear, then sets vertically and goes through all that. And then the final stages is the line honing for the cam tunnel and the main line tunnel, with now the hardware that you put on it, which are the main caps, the hardware. That's the final stages of the assembly of the part before the sleeves are put in. Once that's done, then you machine for the sleeves and the register, and you got to know your clearances for all of that and in which to do that. And then it's ready for the final stages of assembly. But normally the sleeves are undersized until you know what bore the guy wants and where you're going to go with that. And it's the same situation with the cylinder heads. The cylinder heads have to be done in the same manner. And some are water heads and some are solid heads, depends upon the application. In the marine engine, which is the 10 liter, they're all pretty much water heads. Very few were made solid. They were a few, but not many. And even the 12 two-deck heights were just a select few of those made, but the majority were 11 two-decks when they made the 10 liter. The most popular and still living and working today under a different name is what Miner Brothers have, which is that 8.3 liter with Bob Miner's variations of what he has done. And he's had great success with it. I give him all the credit in the world. He's done a heck of a job. It's just that I've been blessed to have him in the marketplace, because the bottom line is that's where I get my customers from, is his well, I could say, I'll just say his behavior and how he's dealt with some of them and doesn't want to deal with the older stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So,
And why 8.3? It's like 504 inch or something.
yeah, it's a 500 incher. Yeah, and the 10 liter was 600 inch.
600.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's pretty much that. But the deal was that since I've had the product to play with and to do what I do, I have made changes. I have, for the camshafts, I've gone to Nachi Contreras down there, and he's done the cam cores for me. And he's even designed and built for me a gear drive, a billet gear drive, because I could not buy the one that Bob Miner has through RCD, because they said it was proprietary.
Yep.
I says, well, help yourself. I'll make one.
Yeah.
So that's what I did. So
And the camshafts in the early ones were standard big block Chevy camshafts?
no, they were not, because on the 8.3, the lifter bores were laid over at 49 degrees. So you had to grind the cam for that 49 degree. I had seen guys put Chevy cams in there and not know the difference. But if you put the right cam in there, you're going to have an animal on your hands, because it's going to be the right deal. But it will run.
Yeah.
The motor doesn't know.
I would say.
The motor doesn't know. So what you got to know what you're dealing with when you do that.
Interesting.
Yeah. And but instead of 8620 material that you made the cams out of, I started using 9310 alloy. And it seemed to work fine for the standard racer of today. And then it got serious where it was with the spring pressures they were using, they were cutting grooves in those lobes of the 9310 material, and I'm thinking, well, there's something wrong here. Well, what people don't know is when you heat treat an alloy, the penetration is only 40 to 50 thousandths thick. If you grind a lobe, you've gone below the heat treat, and it makes the cam soft. So you're back where you started from and not really realizing where your problem lies.
Makes sense.
So I decided to start making them out of tool steel. S7 is what I use.
Yes.
Yeah. So I got into that, and I had some successes with that, and I had one failure, but the bottom line was the person that I was dealing with wasn't really straight with me and what took place. He blamed it on the camshaft of the failure of the cam. But in reality, I says, well, if that's the case, send me all of your parts. I want to see everything that you've got. Send me everything that's been damaged on your motor. Send me the whole thing. I want to see it. If you want your money back and credit for what all this that you're talking to me about that you have to have, send me everything. And he couldn't do it. And he wouldn't do it. Because I think the error was not in what I made. I think it was a combination of other things. But I gave him the option, and that was the only thing that upset me more than anything else, is I couldn't get somebody to shoot straight with me in that regard. So I just had to tell him, I'm sorry, my friend, I don't know what else to tell you, but I said, when I make the part, it's for racing, it's severe usage, it's all of the above.
There's no warranty on it?
Yeah, I says it's 30 seconds or 60 feet is the warranty on these deals. That's kind of where it's at. When it's in your hands, I have no idea what you're going to do with it.
You have no idea who's out there.
Yeah.
And rightly so, because a lot of them just plain don't know what they're doing.
A couple of the other things I started doing that's basically enhanced the parts that I make in making them successful is that the foundry I work with, the owner is a metallurgist. And the foundry is Foundry Works in Bell Gardens, California, and the owner is Javier Vasquez. And Javier was making parts for Nick Arias prior to him going into business. He was making them for another foundry when he worked at. And so he knew the materials and kept meticulous notes on how to put things together when he was building the parts. So as the 10-liter came along, it started to go through its transition. And its transition was, instead of having a bolt-in cam housing and bolt-on bearing support on the face of the block, it was now cast in position where the cam housing was built, including the block itself. It was cast into the block. Okay. And the provision for the bearing supports for the gear drive on the face of the block, they were also cast in position. Prior to that, they looked like a dog bone, and they were held on by Allen screws on the face of the surface of the block. So that's how they were. So that was the major changeover until I got a hold of the stuff. What I started to do was to utilize the information I acquired from the foundry in using a process called hipping. Hipping is well used in the aircraft industry and by the military primarily. And it's a process where a component that's cast, once it's normalized in its given alloy that's provided, it has alloys make a big difference in what goes on in the business, I must tell you that. And with the automotive side of it, several alloys were tried, and I'll talk about that later, because I'll share with you what we're doing here now with the 10-liter. But A356 seemed to be the alloy of choice at this time. But the metallurgist that I was dealing with He was working hand in hand with Alcoa to improve upon the materials, and as it seemed to work out, they started getting business from NASA, JPL, and they were trying to make stuff for the space industry. And so he developed an alloy called BB356, which was an enhanced version of materials taken from and added to this alloy. The other part of it was the blending of the alloy. As you blend metals, changing and adding materials to it, you have to do it at different times, at different heat ratios. So with that in mind, that's how I ended up with what I use in my blocks today. And with the blending of the alloy and the heat treat that was developed by the Foundry, calling out for a different method in how to heat treat what he sends to the heat treater, and then what later goes to the hipping process, is why what I make today stands up like it does. It is so close in its material to billet, but yet billet has a grain structure that only flows one way, whereas the grain structure in what I make flows the shape of the part. The heat treat for the alloy is all the way through in aluminum casting. It's not, this is why you use the different shrinks, the different gating, the different rise ring, the different everything. I have a customer that runs, has purchased blocks from me, 2 8 liters, 8.3 liters, and 4 of the 10 liters that I applied all of this to. And he has apparently sold some, and he also runs himself. He's an engine builder, but has run it himself. He's now, in fact, I spoke to him 3 weeks ago. I got to call him again. But he's got 87 runs on a 10-liter block, and it has held its shape, and he's only changed main bearings one time. And he runs it at 10,300 RPM, runs about 45 to 50 pounds of boost in it consistently, and all of this time that he's run it. And there's no distortion of the product. It doesn't move.
And what's he running in?
A two-wheel drive pull truck.
Two-wheel drive.
Yeah. And he's had a lot of successes with it. But it doesn't do me any good as a producer of parts, because he doesn't advertise where he gets his stuff from. He just has it available to sale, and I'll make you one of these if this is what you want. But he's bought my gear drive, a couple of them. He's bought in fact, the rockers that I make now. I make rockers. I outsource it, of course, but I mean, I make them. He's used my rockers. He's used everything. So I mean, it's he's not, even the cam. I've changed the cam. What I did with the camshaft is that I've instead of having to have the cam hub that drives the major cam gear, it's held on by 2 Woodruff keys and a bolt and a washer, I actually had the cam cores made with the hub built onto the end of it. So I did that, and he just took to it, and he's out actually copying them now. He doesn't even buy them from me. He copies them. But they're a pricey cam. I mean, they're not cheap, you know.
Oh yeah, any of that stuff.
You know, so anyway, but the bottom line is, I don't know if it's flattery or thievery. I'm not sure what it is, but it doesn't make any difference. I can't. You've got no control over anything like that. None of this stuff was patented.
Right.
And based on that fact, it's something that I'm just happy I'm still able to make it happen. And one of my neighbors.
Yeah. Well, didn't Meyer have to sign like a 10-year, or they signed a 10-year agreement that they couldn't produce, Fontana could, Joe Fontana couldn't produce parts for like 10 years or something.
That is probably true. However, the 10-year agreement was for billet parts. He didn't want to buy the cast components for the blocks and the heads. He didn't want anything to do with cast parts. Joe Fontana ran into a problem. As soon as he bought the stuff from Arias, he quit using the Arias foundries and places that he was having all this stuff done and went to his own people. Well, somewheres in the system, something got sideways, and he produced 25 engine blocks that were junk. The alloy and heat treat was wrong. They had major failures, and he was starting hearing inklings of being sued because they were being used in blown and injected alcohol and stuff like that. So he immediately went to Chuck Newton to make a billet block.
I got 2 of those.
Yeah. And so Newton built the product, but always wanted to instill his idea and his concept to all of this stuff. And Newton is a tough guy to get a deal with anyway. An interesting man. But
He won't make a part for any of them right now.
Yeah.
He's like, nope, I'm not making any of them.
Yeah, no, and that's the makeup of the man, because he's independent. That's what he does. So that was the thing. But the billet block then became the mainstay. In fact, Alan Johnson makes them for Bob Miner now. But anyway.
$11,000.
But well, you know, bless his heart. You know, it's still out there. Still people want them. They still produce power, and it was all the original Arias concept, basically, with minor adjustments and changes. And to me, that is what I feel is Nick Arias Jr.'s legacy, is the creativity of what he had and what have you. But the beauty of both engine designs, the 8.3 and the 10-liter, and the idea behind it was that you build the part, make it easy to work on, and it truly became that. It was probably one of the first engines in performance industry to be able to leave the blower drive and all the mechanisms bolted onto the vehicle engine, or whatever vehicle it was, or the engine itself, slide the heads off, pull the pan off, push the pistons in and out, or whatever was necessary to do, bolt everything back together again in a very short period of time. And that's all of the Arias design.